I'm Flavia Bellieni Zimmermann from the Australian School of International Affairs in Western Australia. And today we have with us Dr. Bec Strating. Dr. Strating, she's a senior lecturer at Political Science and International Relations at La Trobe University in Melbourne. And today we are going to be discussing defending the Maritime Rules-Based Order, perspectives from the Indo-Pacific. Thank you for being with us, Dr. Strating.
Thank you for having me.
Dr. Strating, if you can please explain to us why maritime disputes, they are multi-layered.
No worries. Yeah, so one of the central maritime disputes that I look at in my research is the South China Sea. And there's actually a lot going on in the South China Sea disputes. So we can broadly carve them up into two different areas. The first pertains or relates to who owns particular land features within this area. So these are issues to do with sovereignty, they're issues to do with history, they're issues to do with territorial ownership over, who gets the right to claim that they own these particular features, whether they're islands, whether they're rocks, whether they're low-lying elevations. These issues can also come into play because the sovereignty dispute sits alongside maritime disputes. Now, maritime, when I say a maritime dispute, I'm talking about entitlements to different resources and how different maritime zones are established. So under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, there are all of these different rules about who gets what when it comes to maritime resources. So, from a state's coastline, you've got a 12 nautical mile territorial sea, and then you might have a contiguous zone, which is 24 nautical miles beyond the coastline, an exclusive economic zone which provides things like rights to fishing is 200 nautical miles, and then you have a continental shelf which provides rights to things like oil and gas, which can be even longer than 200 nautical miles if the conditions are right. And so who owns the land matters for determining those types of entitlements. But also what matters is what that land constitutes. So if it's an island, for example, states might be able to claim, in some circumstances, a full 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone. But if it's a rock under UNCLOS, under the International Law of the Sea, it's only able to generate a 12 nautical mile territorial sea. And if it's not a rock, if it's not an island and it's not a rock and it's, it's a low-lying elevation, then it's not entitled to those maritime zones. And so these two things kind of sit beside each other, and they can often get quite conflated or confused in the discussions. But essentially, the sovereignty issue is different but related issue to the contests around resources, to fishing, resources to oil and gas, and so on. There's other layers to this, of course, in terms of freedom of navigation and what states can do in these particular zones. So some states suggest that warships don't get rights to innocent passage within 12 nautical miles of territorial sea, whereas the United States would certainly argue and does, through its FONOP program, argue that they do have these sorts of rights. So there's these challenges around how the rules are interpreted, and there are other sorts of issues around, grey zone operations and hybrid warfare that also enter into the fray. So there's a lot of complexity when it comes to a dispute like the South China Sea, and other sort of maritime disputes can also play into who owns what and how that then determines or impacts upon access to marine resources and their capacities to extend their sort of authority out into the seas.
Mm-hmm. And Dr. Strating, when we are talking about the Indo-Pacific, what are the leading maritime disputes in the region?
Well, I would say South China Sea and the East China Sea disputes are the big ones. So the South China Sea is really high profile because the United States is really concerned about what China's attempts at control over that space mean for freedom of navigation and also mean for strategic concerns. So whether or not the artificial island building, which is another aspect to that dispute that adds a whole other layer, whether the artificial island building and the military installations that have gone on with that artificial island building has enabled China to wrest control of the seas within that crucial first island chain. So there's big strategic issues that are that come into play, as well as the legal issues around who owns what. So in terms of great power competition, the South China Sea is really important. The East China Sea disputes are really important too. So we've got the two main ones there are contests over Senkaku, Dieo islands between Japan and China. And the other one is between Japan and South Korea over Dr. Takashima. And so these are primarily disputes over ownership, over sovereignty. And so sovereignty can really bring in all of this stuff around nationalism and identity and history. The Dr. Takashima dispute, for example, is really interesting because you've got Japan and South Korea who neither of these states want to let go of what are essentially a pair of rocks, right? There's not a lot of material value associated with these rocks, but they're playing into this history, this, the tensions, the sort of Japanese colonial history and the memories that are associated with that history. So they become really associated with identity and a sense of national politics. But I think also the one that we should think about, it's not really a maritime dispute in my mind, but Taiwan is also really important when thinking about, the first island chain and about the strategic concerns that the United States has, and of course the interest that China has in, reunifying Taiwan with the mainland. So these are the sort of the three key, I guess, maritime flashpoints that I see as being quite important for the Indo-Pacific. But there are a range of smaller and lower profile ones that can be quite interesting too. I mean, of course, Australia has resolved its issue with Timor-Leste over the Timor Sea, but that took, that maritime dispute took a long time to resolve, and there are still elements of that dispute that are kind of running now, still kind of continuing on in some forms. So there are, these smaller disputes between states, of course, the Southeast Asian states also within the South China Sea, they have their own disputes going on as well. So we shouldn't just be focused on the high profile ones. There are actually a range of different things going on in this area.
Thank you very much, Dr. Strating. And if you could please expand a little bit more, when we are talking about maritime disputes and maritime security, the role played by the US-led security leadership in the region and the rules-based order, how does it play out with other emerging actors in the Indo-Pacific?
Well, the United States is really interesting on the issue of maritime law because it hasn't actually ratified the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. So there is a bit of exceptionalism in the United States approach to to international maritime law. It follows the rules in accordance with a customary law, but there is a bit of an issue with not actually ratifying it and essentially privileging US sovereignty ahead of sort of legitimising that convention, which in the contemporary environment with the South China Sea, you know, China's really pushing narratives around, you know, that the United States is being a provocative actor in the South China Sea through its FONOPs, through its freedom of navigation operations, that these are a form of kind of the hegemony of navigation, that the US is trying to impose its will on the region, and has a variety of different what they call lawfare strategies, sort of amber claims like the 9-dash line and historic rights to try to assert control in the area. And so while the United States sits outside of the convention, it kind of undermines its capacity to really push back against some of these narratives, because it just kind of looks like the United States is really just privileging its own sovereignty, which is essentially what China does, right? So what China does in the South China Sea is a form of exceptionalism with Chinese characteristics, one would say. So there is a bit of a legitimacy deficit here for the United States, which isn't to say that it doesn't, support the basics of the rules through its, Freedom of Navigation's Operation Program, which is a global program designed to challenge excessive maritime claims, not just of China, but of a range of different states, because there are different interpretations. And in fact, there are a number of states in the Indo-Pacific, including India and including South Korea, who have a different interpretation of freedom of navigation. Even the Southeast Asian claimant states in the South China Sea can have a different interpretation of military freedom of navigation to what the United States does. The question is, if the United States is really making free and open Indo-Pacific about freedom of navigation and overflight, is this a narrative that's going to work for everyone and all the states in terms of how they're trying to, really consolidate partnerships and consolidate their alliances? Because, alliances, the hub and spoke system is at the core of the US-led order, which, I guess we're seeing that order is now kind of in decline because it's being challenged by China as a rising power. But there are issues, that's why I research this. I think that it's really important to sort of understand how different states and why different states choose to interpret things like freedom of navigation differently, and what that means for cooperation, and what that means for how states can band together to try to defend the rules. Because actually, one of the other narratives that I forgot to mention before is that China wasn't really at the table for UNCLOS negotiations, which is not the case. UNCLOS, the third convention, was finalised in 1982, and was actually, the negotiations were led by then third world states, including from people like Ambassador Tommy Koh from Singapore, ambassadors from countries like Indonesia, who were really important in devising these rules. So it's not just a simple case of Western imposition. In fact, the United States and the USSR were on a unity ticket when it came to freedom of navigation, and it was these smaller states that wanted the EEZ because they wanted to be able to access these resources to help with their development. So these kind of different attempts at influence and persuasion and the use of narratives is really interesting.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. And wrapping up our interview, Dr. Strating, if you could please expand a bit more and explain to us, when we are talking about maritime disputes, we have the 2019 US Indo-Pacific report. In the light of the report, if you could please give us some remarks on the implications for maritime security in the region.
Yeah, so in June, the United States Department of Defense released its Indo-Pacific strategy report. And one of the striking elements of this report, to me, is the emphasis on alliances and partners in the region. The emphasis on like-minded states. So there's a few narratives that emerge, or there's kind of three prongs to the narrative around the United States and alliances. The first one is that the United States considers its alliances and partnerships to be very important in the Indo-Pacific. So that's the first prong, that these like-minded states are important for US power and influence in the region. The second is that it's these alliances and partnerships that give the United States a comparative advantage compared with China, who it sees as not having the same sorts of relationships with states in the region. The third prong is that while, yes, the US is really supportive of wants to be supportive of alliances and partnerships because this does provide an advantage. At the same time, these allies and partners have to step up. They have to do more of the burden sharing. And that is a fairly consistent kind of narrative, not just in the Indo-Pacific, but as we've seen out of the Trump administration more globally, which has really important implications, I think, for partners like Australia. I mean, does this mean that the United States expects that Australia is going to contribute to food and navigation operations? Because so far the response from Australia has been not to make a decision, which is essentially, no, they're not doing them. So what kind of pressures might that impose on regional states is an interesting question. And going back to the idea of interpretations of maritime rules, and the fact that these states have their own strategic interests and they all have unique relationships with China, and particularly around trade, raises questions about how like-minded these states actually are, and what the United States can do to bolster the US-led order, or to try to defend it, or to try to at least salvage part of it, depending on what your view is.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Strating, for being with us.
That's been great to be here. Thank you.
And thank you for being with us. For more information, please visit our website, www.internationalaffairs.org.au. Thank you.